India is known for its depth of culture, incredible food, welcoming people, and stunning wildlife. Experience all of this and more with Gulliver's sports, travels, packages, and tours to the World Cup this October and November. Packages include guaranteed official match tickets, accommodation, stadium transfers, flights, and more. To find out more information, visit their website, gulliverstravel.co.uk, or call them on 01684 878 937. Hello and welcome to the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast. England have named a provisional squad for this year's World Cup. Ben Stokes is in it, Harry Brook is not. I'm Yas Rana, and discussing that with me this morning is Joe Harman, Phil Walker, and Katya Witney. But first, let's hear from Mark Butcher to hear what he has to say on the squad. Mark, the headline news from England's World Cup squad announcement was that Ben Stokes has returned and that there is no room for Harry Brook. Before we get to Stokes, it feels odd that Brook, given the year that he's had in all forms of cricket, really, isn't making the plane. I guess you can understand it because they want to have depth in the bowling department. But what do you make of the decision that England have made?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it really. I think that neither Milan or Roy, there's two specialist batters beyond, past achievements, all of which have been stellar. But it's been such a long time since they've shown any sort of form going into it. And Brook is so startlingly good that not finding a place for him, the England's sort of specialist batters in the group, I suppose, if you count Butler as one of those, despite being, of course, an all-rounder as a keeper. They're all, what the youngest is probably Joe Root, isn't he? At 32. Yeah, I mean, he's younger than Joss. Johnny's 33, Milan's 35, J. Roy's 33, Joss is 32, and obviously you've got Ben in there who's playing as a specialist batter as well at the 32. It just seems to me that somebody of Brook's incredible ability should have found a way in at the expense of one of those two guys. Now, they're pointing to Milan and saying, well, we want to have the left-handed option to be able to mix things up in the top order, which is all well and good. However, just the lack of any sort of form whatsoever says to you if he might as well turn around and bat right-handed at the moment. The way it's gone. So, I don't see that one. I really don't. And I think that there should have been room found for him. Now, the fact that Stokes has been picked doesn't surprise anybody. It certainly doesn't surprise me. I expected that to happen anyway. I just didn't see it coming at the expense of Harry Brook.
I guess the squad has a feel of that England have really tried to hang on to the 2019 group for as long as possible. And as you say, it's a pretty old squad. In England's defence, it's been quite hard to integrate players into the ODI team over the last couple of years. It would have been nearly 2 years between Harry Brook's T20I debut and the World Cup final. And there have only been 6 ODI series from then to now. He's played in one of them. I think 3 of them he couldn't play because of test selection. So it's been very difficult for actually England to bring players through. And they won't be the only side in the world that will suffer because of that.
Well, yeah, that's true. But given that England have already sort of made a point of sort of saying, well, we don't really mind how much ODI cricket they play as long as there's some form in white ball cricket somewhere, i.e. whether that be in franchises or T20 domestically or whatever, then not a problem. And I agree with that. I don't see that there's a massive, particularly with players who've played a lot of the format in the past, which I suppose Harry Brook doesn't qualify for. I don't see a massive issue with that because the game is only stretched out a little bit longer, and guys of high ability like that can adapt. And other players have been picked on the strength of very similar things. Reece Topley's been out injured the whole time, has barely played any ODI cricket whatsoever, but he plays. Which is absolutely quite right. I do not see that his lack of ODIs in the last couple of years as being a reason to leave him out. I really don't. Also you kind of look at the squad, and I know there'll be tweaks and tinkers, and think that have England got, are there too many sort of medium pace bowling all-rounder options in that squad? Not enough specialist batters maybe, or not enough bowlers of slightly higher pace, maybe not of higher skill. And do they need as many quicks as they're taking at the moment? So look, all of this will be revealed. We've got a New Zealand series come up, which would be great because they're a fantastic team, got really, really strong bowling resources. That should be highly competitive. And we'll get a slightly better idea of how everything's going to look after that. But the headlines difficult to get away from, and Brook missing out is I think is a mistake.
Mm. And I guess as well with that New Zealand series, I was surprised that they didn't give Brook those games to kind of give himself another chance to press forward his case. You know what he could be capable of, and I'm surprised that England haven't given him every single chance to force his way into that side.
Yeah, and I think given the sort of particularly in the Test arena, I suppose, given their wish to elevate players of high skill above those who perhaps might have better records going back, or players with high ceilings, it just seems slightly at odds with the philosophy of what has gone on in English cricket in the last the last 18 months or so. But of course, it's they're different management groups, different captains who might see things slightly differently, and that's entirely within their remit to be able to do so. But I still think that he's just so good, and this is the point: is that regardless of how much or how little ODI cricket that he's played, it would not take him very long to kind of get up to speed, because he is such a rare talent. I mean, it's sort of like it's sort of saying that Sachin shouldn't get into an Indian ODI squad back in the day because he was too young or something. It's just there are some people that just have it, whatever it may be, and finding ways to accommodate them at the expense of older players who have probably reached their peak, reached their zenith, would be a much bolder and much more satisfying move from our point of view to talk about. But I think also in terms of the team, I think you need that injection of a bit of genius knocking around in these tournaments, and Brook has that in spades.
There are 6 weeks to go to the World Cup, and I think one other interesting part of the squad and how England have gone about ODI cricket in the last couple of years that I think will become more of a talking point as we approach the World Cup is the use of the number 6 position. Josh Buttler batted there when England won the World Cup in 2019. He's batted higher up in the order since, and it's just so different to batting 6 in T20s where you're just a pure finisher. You have to be able to come in at 100 for 4, but also maybe 300 for 4 with 5 overs to go. And Liam Livingstone has played a fair bit of cricket at number 6 for England, and I'm not. That's such a difference, Livingstone to Buttler, and I wonder if I wonder if Brook could have been the number 6 actually, and you've found a way to squeeze him in there.
If you've gone to Ben Stokes, you brought Ben back in the side, and that's his position, isn't it? The guy that has the ability to play all the way through the gears from 1 to 8. And has all that experience playing in what you rightly say is a very pivotal position in ODIs, then that's where you put him. I certainly wouldn't put because, but for exactly the reason that you mentioned, somebody like Ben, you're quite happy to see walk to the crease at 90 for 4 with 30 overs to go. That's not you wouldn't want to be sending Liam Livingstone out there at that point. I guess all of this is conjecture, simply because teams now, ever since the advent of T20, has been so much more flexible and fluid in terms of where batters walk out during the course of a 50 over game. But I would say that if Ben Stokes is in that starting 11, then 6 would be the ideal. He would be the ideal player for 6 rather than 6 being ideal for him.
And what's worth saying that there'll be people watching and listening to us kind of wondering about Milan. Milan's England form has been good, but it's his domestic form that hasn't been good, to the extent that he's been dropped from the Trent Rocket side in the 100. And I don't think he's played any of their last 3 games. The other exciting headline from the squad announcement was the inclusion of Gus Atkinson, who's yet to play a game for England. Butch, having watched him in the Blast and the 100, what can England fans expect from Atkinson?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I saw him at any length actually was in the Championship, and he was very, very impressive there with the red ball. And he has, obviously Archer missing out, and Archer sort of, having disappeared once again from the cricketing scene for indefinitely. Atkinson is an ideal replacement. I mean, his bowling action is not dissimilar. His approach is not dissimilar. He even complains that when it isn't coming out at the sort of speed that he'd like, that people accuse him of not trying in the same way that that has happened to Jofra Archer throughout his career, simply because of the easy way in which he generates that pace and that bounce. So yeah, he's in much the same way that I'm talking about sort of somebody like Harry Brook. He's somebody that is a sort of that is a wildly talented player who at the moment doesn't have a massive amount of a record behind him, but for whom the ceiling is extremely high. So that's, England wanted to take extreme pace. They've kind of, Mark Wood is there. I reckon that he'll be fine. I think the three Ashes Test matches back to back will have actually given him, if they haven't ruined him, will have actually given the body sort of like the resilience that he's going to need to get through a World Cup. And I think it'll seem like a breeze after playing those three back-to-back Test matches, and then having another option like Atkinson knocking around, who may or may not make the final 15, is another really good thing for English cricket. And look, the World Cups are kind of won on the back of, yes, you want experienced players and you want guys who kind of battle hard and have been there and done it before, but you also need standout performers. I mean, it's the clue's in the name. It's World Cups, and you need world class players and players who are going to kind of rise above the general level of excellence that will push you over the line at times. So the more players like that you can squeeze into your squad, the better.
And finally, what do you think expectations should be for England? They're double world champions, but winning in India is an altogether different challenge. And as we were saying earlier, they haven't really regenerated the side as you might have expected 4 years ago.
Yeah, I still think that the semi-final stage is more than realistic. And once you do that, if you get there with a group who've been there and done it all before, then the chances of then being successful overall go through the roof, don't they? Because that experience really does start to count for things. But so I don't think that that's beyond the pale. I was convinced before the World T20 that they were sort of, that England were playing down, that they were the best team in it and they won it. I'm not quite so cocksure about it this time, but I still think that they'll be good enough to make it through to the knockouts.
Cheers for your time, Butch. Catch you next time. Joe, I know we talked about it on last week's show, but let's start with Stokes. He's confirmed to be in as a specialist batter just over a year since he retired from the format. He's only batted 9 times in ODI cricket since the last World Cup. He's not going to bowl, we don't think. How much of a difference does he make just as a pure batter in this setup, with Owen Morgan having retired last year as well?
Makes a huge difference. I fell into the trap of not wanting him in my T20 World Cup side, partly because I didn't think he's as good at that format. Definitely not want to fall into the trap again this time. Yeah, if he wants to play and he seems to be enthusiastic about doing so, then get him in. It's a no-brainer. The only debate was how the other pieces fell into place and which other pieces didn't even make it in the squad in the first place. And the omission of Harry Brook really surprised me. I disagree with it.
You do?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I can understand why you pick Malan, but I just wouldn't have done it. I think you can look at stats. You can look at Malan's record is brilliant in the 50 over format, but just watch them. Just watch Harry Brook. He's so good. He's 24 now. The next World Cup rolls around, he'll be 28. Who knows what the state world cricket will be in. This is the time to pick him. And it reminded me, it took me back to Stokes not being selected for the 2015 World Cup squad when the stats said that was the right call. But in the end, they picked Gary Ballance, James Taylor, Ravi Bopara, all fine cricketers, but nowhere near as good as Ben Stokes. It's a world tournament, so you pick your best players. And I think Harry Brook has already shown, regardless of the format, that he is among those. I think he's a victim of the fact that he hasn't been able to play 50 over cricket because he's good at the other stuff. And I think that should have been taken into account when you're picking your squad.
I totally agree with that point. I think it's absolutely bang on. I think if he'd played, say, 15 ODIs from, say, the moment where he made his first T20 debut in
January 22, yeah.
2.5 years ago, whatever it would have been, he'd at least have played 20 odd ODIs under any normal functioning calendar, and then you'd have seen what he can do.
Exactly. And I'm also a bit unsure what role Malan's been picked for. because he has got a brilliant record, almost all at 3. I think he's got 1 century as an opener. So if they picked him as a backup, is this a concern about Jason Roy's form, which, you know, is understandable? Because I don't see them picking him at 4. I don't think you want route 3, Milan 4, really. That doesn't feel like it's got... It feels a little bit samey in some ways in terms of putting an injection of pace into the innings.
It feels like they're hedging their bets a little bit on Roy, that they don't fully back him. Milan's kind of in the squad as a Roy replacement. And when you only have 4 players in the squad who don't make the starting 11, you kind of want more flexibility from the spare batter. And I don't think Milan is particularly flexible as a 50-over player. He's very, very good. And I actually think they should have been bolder and just made a call between Roy and Milan. And it feels like they're just delaying that a little bit. And
I'm wary of drifting into criticising Milan, because that's not my perspective. It's Harry Brook is so good, he has to go, and Milan is the unfortunate one to miss out. So I'd have picked Brook over Livingston as well, but they're not really the same player. I can see Livingston is going to be really crucial for the overs that he can bowl. He'll probably play more matches than not, and he'll be their second or third spinner depending on the balance of the side.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be, as you acknowledge that, but by saying you'd have favoured him over Livingston as well. But the Jason Roy question would have been raised and is a legitimate one as well. It needn't be one or t'other from Milan or Brook. They could have been daring and said, okay, Jason, your record overall is great. You've been fabulous, but the last year and a half you've been very in and out in ODI cricket. I know he's made a couple of hundreds, but there's been binary scores in and around that. He's 33 and all the rest of it. And they could have made that call as well. So it didn't necessarily have to be just a shootout between Milan and Brook.
Can I launch my defence of Dawid Milan? Because I did say...
You shouldn't be having to defend him. We're not criticising Milan, but yeah, go for it.
But I did say on last week's pod that I would pick Milan over Brook. And I stand by that, but I agree with what Phil and Yas have said, that it's not a straight pick, or it shouldn't have been a straight pick between Milan and Brook. I think there was room for both of them in the squad, but I think you can't negate what Milan has done over the last few years in ODI cricket. It's not just that he's been, one of the best for England. He's genuinely been one of the best in the world in ODI cricket over the last few years. And Brook is exceptional, and he is one of those talents that you look at him and you want him in every side. But like you guys said, there is an element that Brook hasn't been given the best shot at cementing himself in that ODI side. But purely on what Milan's done, you have to have him in the side. And if that means that Brook doesn't make it in, unfortunately, that's what it means. Brook, I'm sure, will go to India as one of the injury replacements.
This is the other thing. We are such a long way out from this tournament. Yeah. We've got 2 series before we even get to that tournament. There's every chance there's an injury. And Brook does get in there anyway. But I just think, and I take your point on Milan's record, but part of the problem here is that ODI cricket means very little. So I'm not sure it does stack up to say you have to pick him based on his record when he's been part of a sort of second choice England side playing some second choice opposition at times. Do those runs count as much as the talent that you see from Harry Brook or Ben Stokes in this case, who obviously hasn't played in those games?
If you look at the runs Milan has made, I think they do. It's not just that he's made runs. He's made very, very good runs. Like the hundreds he's scored have been brilliant hundreds. I think of the one in Australia just after he got dropped from the T20 side. He made one in Bangladesh as well. And I just think they've created the problem by not picking them both, basically. Milan's doing a sterling job of defending me by being dropped by Trent Rockets now. But there are those ODIs against New Zealand and the ODIs against Ireland. There's every possibility Milan will not be in form against New Zealand and Ireland and will not be in that squad. And that, that's fine. If he proves that he's not in form enough to go to the World Cup, then Harry Brook absolutely should be put into the side over him.
When you say you'd have picked them both, do you mean for the upcoming series and then decided on one of them for the World Cup itself? Yeah, I can absolutely see that.
Milan's the incumbent, and there's no reason to drop Milan. He's the incumbent. He proves that he's not in form before being dropped for me.
But I think it's interesting, like a philosophical question on what his form, because his England form is good, but he's not in the Trent Rocket side. He's had a similar-ish domestic summer to the domestic summer that Jason Roy had last year that led to him being dropped without having to do that badly for England to be dropped, if that makes sense. And yeah, I'm so surprised Brook's not in the squad for the New Zealand series. That was an opportunity to find out more about him. England were very smart with how they used the Pakistan T20s before the T20 World Cup last year. They used it as an opportunity to give game time to players who might not necessarily have gone on the tour, but they used it as a learning tool.
And obviously relevant to Brook as well, right? He played one particular knock that was so outrageously good that any questions just dissipated on the back of that.
It feels like, I was wondering this morning as I was coming in whether Owen Morgan would have made this call, whether Ben Stokes would have made this call, whether Brendan McCullum would have made this call. And I think all three of them would have picked Harry Brook. It doesn't feel quite in keeping with the whatever the question, put your foot on the gas, which was what Morgan introduced and what Stokes and McCullum have taken on with the test side. Is that a little indicator of Butler and Mott thinking slightly differently, being slightly more pragmatic in terms of the style of play, that they're going to the subcontinent? Are they thinking about Harry Brook's quite poor IPL? I know he had one absolutely brilliant innings. But it does feel like a little bit of a departure away from England selections of recent time.
Just on a point, Phil, you made earlier on, in that, so Brook makes his England debut January 2022, nearly 2 years between that and the World Cup. England have played 6 series so far in ODI cricket between then and now. 3 of them he couldn't play because he was in the test squad. One of them was when he was in the test squad but not actually playing at the start of last summer. But there was the home summer last year against India and South Africa. He could have played, but England chose not to play him. Do you think that in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, England probably haven't managed the integration of the next generation as quickly as they should have done? It kind of feels like they were just hanging on to the 2019 squad for as long as possible, and a gap presented itself quite late on through the retirement of Morgan, but they didn't give themselves enough of a chance to fill that gap confidently.
I think something always has to make way these days, and clearly your 50 over priorities are long gone. And when you look at the players that have played across those sort of rather bitty series that you mentioned, there's been runs for Jason Roy, for example. You know, he's made 3 since the start of last year across 18 games. I just brought it up. He's made 300s, albeit, and this isn't to denigrate, but you know, a quick 100 against the Netherlands in that mad game in Amsterdam when they broke records, and he made 100 against Bangladesh, and he made a good 100 against South Africa. In amongst that, against Australia and India, he didn't get any runs. Nonetheless, if you imagine, and this is not to be about Jason Roy, but just using him as an example, he did have those opportunities and made runs against teams that you'd expect him to make runs against. If you were to transpose Brook into those games, then you would see, then the argument against including him, he's only played 3 games, becomes irrelevant, because you'd at least have some kind of sample size to make that decision. In the absence of that, and with the lines between 20 over cricket and 50 over cricket being smudged ever more, and even the line between Test cricket and 50 over cricket being smudged. I mean, anyone who saw that run chase in the 3rd Test match, that was a white ball run chase. That was a 50 over white ball run chase in everything but name. And he iced it, didn't he? So I think I hear what Joe's saying, and this isn't about individuals. This is about having to try and judge a player's value and worth in the absence of statistical evidence, because the whole system or the structure or the schedule, whatever, is carved up in such a way that there has to be some give, and there has to be areas where players have to be judged on the eye test and on supposition rather than evidence, because the evidence isn't necessarily there all the time.
In answer to your question about the kind of his management or the management of Brook, I wouldn't be too critical of the England selectors, really. I mean, you just can't have it all. There is so much cricket, and look at the way his Test careers started. I mean, would he necessarily been able to do that if he was kind of jumping from one squad to another? They said pretty clearly that the Test squad takes priority until the major tournaments come around. I think they've pretty much stayed true to that. So, yeah, it has resulted in Brook slipping through the cracks, but think of all the other brilliant stuff that it might well have contributed to as well. So I wouldn't be too critical on that point.
Katya, obviously ODI cricket has taken a back seat since 2019, and it's interesting just comparing the likely makeup of the England top 6 for 2023 compared to 2019. So Roy and Bairstow, or maybe Milan and Bairstow open. Root will bat 3. Milan, as we said earlier, has basically never batted outside the top 3 in ODIs, and he's potentially the spare bat. Stokes batted 5 in the 2019 World Cup cycle. Buttler batted 6, but has since moved up to 5. What do you think of Butler's move change since 2019? In the 2019 World Cup, Buttler bat 6, and it's likely that Liam Livingstone will bat 6 in 2023. Two very, very different types of players.
It's interesting that, like, when Morgan retired, Butler's kind of shifted up the order to become more of a middle order rather than lower order batter, because they wanted Liam Livingstone in the side, whether that's the right thing to do or not. But I think that having Buttler at number 6 was such an integral part of that 2019 side, and to not have Buttler at 6 now almost makes the side feel a little bit like, by no means obviously a weak side, because any side with just Buttler in it isn't, but a weaker side than it was in 2019, because I think sometimes that's underestimated how much winning that World Cup wasn't just about having the best players pound for pound or playing the way they did under Owen Morgan. It was about having a perfectly balanced side that was crafted over these years. And so few to no sides have the luxury of having a player like Jos Buttler, who can almost anchor an innings after a chase and score 100 off 50, 60 balls at number 6. And that was such an important element of the side. It comes down to Stokes a little bit as well, that Stokes isn't bowling anymore and they can't have that balance that they want. But even if it means you're sacrificing having that all-rounder in the side, I still feel having Buttler at 6 would be the right way to go. And then Joe Root comes in and bowls you a few overs and you have 5 bowlers, bits and pieces players, Sam Curran, David Willey, Chris Wokes, those kinds of players down the order. But that long batting lineup with someone like that down the order, I think they're missing a trick by having him at 5 rather than at 6. I think it's really important to England's users side that he is at number 6.
Persuasive case, really. And again, it just if we can sideline for a moment the opening question, the Milan, Roy, etc. If we could just pick 16, right, and everyone's happy, then Root, Brook, Stokes, Buttler.
Oof.
That is a devastating 3, 4, 5, 6, isn't it? And perhaps if you're chasing, you need 120 in 11 overs, then obviously Buttler comes into 5 and Stokes hangs back at 6 or whatever. But that is a brutally good middle order. And you're right, as it stands, it doesn't feel quite as complete without the fantasy element of Brook in there. And if we do end up, say, with Livingstone slipping in there at 6, I know he's explosive, but that is a lot to ask for a player who hasn't yet demonstrated that he's consistently a match-winning and match-turning figure in that crucial, pivotal fulcrum right in the middle order.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people don't appreciate just how different batting 6 in ODI cricket is compared to T20. In T20s, you're a finisher, but you could be in 100 for 4 after 20 overs, and you've got to be capable of, as you said, Katya, play very different types of innings and have that sort of flexibility. Another headline from the squad announcement is Gus Atkinson is in the squad. And I know that, again, we talked about him on last week's show, but I don't think that many people had him in to be in the 15-man squad. Jofra Archer is named as one of the reserves, so he might come in if he regains fitness and one of the seamers is injured at some point during the World Cup. Joe, it's just amazing how quickly a bowler's life can change if they add an extra yard of pace. He's never played for England, but could conceivably be starting in the World Cup in 6 weeks' time.
It is an amazing story, and you were one of a few who said at the start of the season that he might be playing. I think you were talking about Test cricket at that point, but when you start bowling that quickly, you're going to interest all formats, really. Yeah, I mean, I don't think many of us saw that it would be a bare 15 they were picking. So my assumption was that he would be part of a broader squad, and if he went really well, then he might end up in the World Cup squad. Now what's happened is he's effectively been picked to the World Cup squad, which can be changed, but he's now in pole position, which is an amazing turnaround, really, based on still relatively little evidence. But when you see someone cracking up to 94, 95 miles an hour, albeit maybe a bit of scepticism about the 100 speed gun, then you're going to turn heads, and you can see the way that very, very good players are struggling to play him. He's got that kind of slippery bouncer. You can absolutely see why when Jofra Archer is not fit, that they're thinking, well, where else do we look? And Gus Atkinson is the player they've landed on. Also, when we're talking, the debate we've had about the batters, all these brilliant players that have missed out, Ben Duckett and other, Will Jacks. With the seamers, I'm struggling to think of any seamers that I'm thinking they should have been in that squad, or they're really unlucky not to be in that squad, given that the injuries that are around at the moment. I think it makes perfect sense as a pick. The interesting thing will be if he, and given his form, he should go well. But if he doesn't go very well against New Zealand, are they prepared to say, sorry, this hasn't worked out and we're going to bring someone in with more experience? They've basically said this is their World Cup squads. So that it does feel, again, a little bit like you were saying about Milan, maybe just pick him in the squad. It feels like Milan and Brook for the New Zealand series. Maybe they've made a rod for their own backs here by not giving themselves more flexibility.
I think they've taken a bit of a risk with it though, right? Because they've said Jofra Archer's going to go as their injury replacement. So if one of them does break down early in the tournament, they might take another one as well. But if Gus Atkinson breaks down, he's got a history of injuries, hasn't he? You know, they have taken a little bit of a risk of saying you're in our squad for the tournament. So.
I found that slightly odd with Jofra.
You said something about the length of the tournament, doesn't it? You're not fit for the start of it, but you might be able to play the second half. If you have a 7-week World Cup, I guess that's what
and so if somebody's injured midway through the tournament and the ICC doctors basically approve it, you can then bring in a replacement halfway through the tournament. Interesting. On Atkinson, we're all very excited, and for obvious reasons. And even just watching him warm up at the Oval last week in the build up to an Invincibles game, when you got the bowling coach with the baseball mitt and everyone else, and he's playing in a good side, right? The Curran boys and Zach Chappells can wang it down there at decent pace. Johnson as well, right? Atkinson's on a different level, and the bowling coach is taking it in front of his face, and you can feel the propulsion as he's having to duck and weave 30 yards back from the stumps. So he has real pace, absolutely, but what he doesn't have is anywhere near the big match experience yet, obviously. And it is a big gamble, I think, to bring in... I back the selection, but it could go up in your face, especially if the ball isn't doing very much after the first few overs, which is often the case. And that kind of bowler, who would never have bowled in India, never have bowled on Indian tracks...
He's played 2 50-over games professionally.
Right, yeah, okay. And it's all very well bending your back and blasting through 20 balls or 24 balls every now and then when you play a white ball game. But bowling 2 spells of 10 overs, and if Stokes isn't bowling, then you don't have as many options as you used to have. So if he does get the nod for any games, that's a big ask. And tactically as well, as much as anything else. He obviously has skill and he has raw pace, but it could go wrong. It's not a banker by any means, but fair play to them for giving it a run for sure. But those games loom large next month.
Yeah, I suppose the flip side of he hasn't got that big match experience, but also, and this only lasts for a certain period of time, but no one's seen him, and that can actually, given the amount of data analysis and the amount of kind of microscopic examinations of players that goes into playing professional cricket these days, particularly in T20 and by extension 50 over, because it's not so different, I would say now. For the start, people aren't going to know much about Atkinson, and I think that is probably in his favour. But yeah, it's certainly a risk. But like I go back to the fact, I'm not sure there are brilliant bowlers that aren't going who are fit. So in that sense, they didn't have a huge amount to lose.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Phil. I think similar to the discussion on Livingston batting at 6, one thing I like about ODI cricket is it requires a versatility in individual players that you just don't really see in T20.
Yeah.
So Atkinson will, I think if he plays a game, I think he'll probably take the new ball. But he'll have to bowl in the middle overs, which is just unlike anything he has done in his professional career so far. Bowling the middle overs of a 100 or T20 game is just different because you can go at 7s or 8s. Here you need to go at 6s max and hopefully take a few wickets at the same time. And then as a death bowler as well, in the 100, he's really stood out with a new ball, troubling batters when it's swinging and when the ball's really hard and gets it to go through. But we don't really know. The balls are
swinging more, aren't they? Oddly enough, there was a piece, I think Matt Waller did it, and
they think it might be the H on the ball that's different because the balls in the 100 and the T20 Blast have the exact same specification from Kookaburra. But I also think that because of
cricket's so ridiculous.
But I also actually think that because of the rules in the 100 where bowlers can bowl 20 of the first 25 balls if they want, you just have swing bowlers bowling more. So like Dan Worrell can't get in the Surrey team, but he's London Spirit's main man because he can just bowl the new ball and put his feet up afterwards.
Also, might be that Shaheen Afridi was playing in the 100 this year.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, and you got some decent new ball bowlers
Yeah.
Around the country. But also, I'd say on Atkinson, watching him bowl last night, is he's the go-to man in a team that has Spencer Johnson, the Curran brothers, etc. Like he's given the new ball ahead of Sam Curran. Like he is really, really exciting.
Yeah, it's just it can be quite a brutal experience. Bowling pace, if it's and I'm not saying this applies to him. Who can say? He could be the best young quick bowler in the world for all we know. But in India, it can be an exposing place, and sometimes, as we've seen with good bowlers, pace can be perfect for a batter in India.
Yep, definitely. Matt asks, David Willey was barely in the conversation when discussing the squad on the last podcast. Is that because he's not much of an X-Factor bowler, or do we still somewhat underrate him?
I'll answer that because I was on that.
I was going to say,
Katya and me were on that and barely mentioned him. Everyone has players that they have a block on, right? And it's either that you can't see the wood for the trees, you ignore the numbers when they're staring you in the face, or whenever you happen to have watched them live or on TV, they've just stunk the place out rather than played well. David Willey is one of my problems, right? It's odd. He's clearly a very, very good cricketer, and if he's in that squad, then he's in that squad totally on merit. Of course he is, but personally, I do disregard him, and that is my own prejudice and my own ignorance, right? And I totally hold my hand up on that. But whenever I've seen him play live, it's not worked. And the record is not so powerful that it demands attention even for idiots like me. And so I assumed that his version of medium fast, you get a couple of overs out the way early when it swings, and then you possibly come back and you might be good for a long handle 25 off 15 at the death. I didn't think that would be relevant in a squad of 15 to play in India, especially with Topley, who I did assume would be in the side and is, and Curran, who I assumed and is. So it's just surprised me. But then this is a reflection of me rather than him.
Well, I think there are lots of similarities with Milan in that since the last World Cup, only Adil Rashid has taken more ODI wickets for England than Willey. Willey has 32 wickets at 23, and he's done very, very well in series that just didn't get much attention. So against Ireland, Netherlands, Sri Lanka at home, he did average under 17, I think, in all of those series. And I wonder, Joe, we were talking about it just before we started recording on like what the makeup of the bowling attack's going to be. Does Willey's inclusion suggest that Sam Curran is probably going to start in that Atkinson may be cover for Wood and Willey for Sam Curran in terms of they're very similar cricketers, left arm bowlers who bat a bit down the order?
Yeah, I guess it does. I mean, Willey feels the furthest away from playing in a World Cup 11 in that 15 to me as I look at that squad. I think a lot of that is to do with the conditions out there. Obviously, he's a handy batter, but he's not going to bat a 7. He's a good 9 or he's an okay 8, I would say. I mean, I'm pleased for him that he's in there. Obviously, it was really gutting that he missed out on the eve of the last one to Jofra Archer, who'd been a big part of the transformation of that one-day side. He would have been in the World Cup if they hadn't shifted the rules so that Archer could play. So I'm glad he's in there. But again, I would go back, who are we saying should have been picked ahead of him? That there is not a huge amount of candidates for that role unless you go with another bolter. And when you've already got Gus Atkinson in that squad, I completely understand that. I mean, this morning I was thinking of other possible options. I was like Chris Jordan, just as an all-round package, unbelievable in the field. He's batted nicely in the 100, a lot of experience, but he's barely played ODI cricket for the last kind of 3-4 years. So that would have felt quite harsh for him to leapfrog Willey, especially given the record that you've described there from Willey in the last couple of years. So I think it's a solid pick. I know what Phil means. It's interesting because as a young player, he was a very, very exciting talent that people really talked about. I think he was particularly explosive as a batter, and that probably hasn't carried on for him. And he's now become this sort of quite steady new ball bowler who maybe has a bit of a hit and has become a less exhilarating cricketer as a result, and therefore does kind of slip beneath the radar sometimes. But his record is good. and he's worthy of his place in the squad.
But that's the point, really, isn't it? We've already described Atkinson as a risk, and Wood is kind of always a risk because he could break down, especially during such a long World Cup. You need a banker in there, and that's what David Willey feels like. I have a similar view on him to you, Phil. I have that kind of block of like, David Willey, he's all right, but he's not that X factor. Maybe that's what you need when you have a squad that's packed with what you hope are going to be X factor bowlers like Atkinson and Topley and all that lot. So that seems a reasonable reason to put him in. To put him in the squad, that you need that kind of dependability.
Yeah, that's all fair.
And it's also worth saying that in 2019, once England landed on 11, they basically didn't change it. Like Liam Dawson, Tom Curran didn't play a game during that World Cup. James Vince only played because of Jason Roy's injury, and the only actual change they made was Plunkett coming in for Moeen. So it might be that these guys don't play at all.
We're talking about the comparison with the batting unit from 2019. It's the bowling that seems most stark. I know that they swapped it with playing the extra seamer, and Moeen didn't play when they'd generally gone with two spinners in the lead up, but that bowling attack was really, really settled. This time, we don't really know what it is. And England are absolutely capable of going and winning this tournament, but I have much less confidence than I did last time around, just because there are quite a few question marks in the side, and we don't know quite how it all fits together. And that's as much a result of the schedule as anything else. They've still got wonderfully talented cricketers. I was interested when I spoke to Owen Morgan a month or so ago about how they were shaping up. And I was like, they're not playing much ODI cricket. Can we say that they're well set for the World Cup? And he said, absolutely, they're shaping up beautifully. And I was like, how do we know that though? I just don't know how we do know that until we get going. We know they've got some really, really good cricketers, but
You're not captain anymore, Owen.
I will say that the change of tone from last week to this week. Last week we were sat going, "God, this looks like a good squad," and now you've just gone, "Oh, there's loads of question marks over it."
Harry Brook's all gone to shit.
Yeah, but look, you're right, and you run through the seamers, and there are certain questions regarding the cohort, really, and again, Adil Rashid could be the bowler of the tournament. Absolutely could, but again, you don't know exactly how he's going to go. Moeen has been a bit hit and miss in white ball cricket of late, and so there are lots more questions than there were this time 4 years ago. In part because of the passage of time, obviously, and they've stuck broadly with the core, and partly because you don't know how they're going to go as a unit in India and the kinds of pitches that they're going to throw up. In the positive camp, if they are fit and they're ready, then Wood, Wokes, Curran, Moeen have all got good experience playing in the IPL. So they do know their way around those kinds of conditions. And so it just doesn't feel like, I'm with Joe, I don't feel quite as at ease with that bowling side going into this World Cup as I did 4 years ago, when you felt like they were in their prime and they were perfect and they had an icon in Jofra. And they don't have that yet in this combination.
But the 2019 side was a genuinely all-time great team that for 4 years were utterly dominant. I think in terms of win percentages going into the World Cup, I think that rivals anything that Australia produced in the 90s, 2000s.
And everybody right in the sweet spot as well.
Yeah. And
all bases covered. In the same interview, Morgan said he felt every single player who got injured, they had a really, really good replacement for. There was someone lined up, apart from Adil Rashid. He said if he got injured, there was nothing we could do about that. That just changed the whole dynamic of the side, because there was no one who could do the things that he could do. In every other position, he felt that they did have that. I'm not sure that's the case now. Take Liam Plunkett, for instance. If we had Liam Plunkett from 2019, he would walk into this side and be a hugely valuable asset. And we haven't really replaced him, I don't think.
Yeah, definitely. And also on the strength of the squad that we probably not really covered on this episode, you got Bairstow coming back, who's arguably one of the best ODI openers ever. Joe Root, who's one of the best ODI number threes ever. Stokes averaged 50 at number 4 in the 4 years ago. They're still quite good.
Yeah.
England also named a T20I squad for the New Zealand series the other day, and included Hampshire seamer John Turner, who's since been injured, so he won't play. But that was a real out of the blue selection, really. South African born. He's only 22 years old. He's not played much pro cricket, but like Atkinson, can bowl around 90 miles per hour. He's been fast tracked into the squad. He's still got 1 year left at uni, and there's a very good interview with him in the Telegraph where it sounded like his dad really didn't fancy his chances of making it as a pro until really quite recently. But again, another example of how quickly your life can change if you can bowl 90.
Were you on the Surrey game when Hampshire played here early in the Blast?
Not in the Blast. Sorry, I did the championship game.
Yeah, okay. I saw him in the Blast at the Oval, and I'd never heard of him before, let alone seen him bowl. And he was a cut above everybody else at the time. And it's a cliche, isn't it? But if you are a young quick, then you're elevated over and beyond everybody else. You have something that no one else can really offer.
And we'll get onto the One Day Cup in a bit, but it was actually his performances in the One Day Cup last year that sort of notified selectors of his potential, because they've got ball tracking data or whatever, and he was clocked at 90 miles per hour, and from that moment on, the England selectors had their eyes on him.
And Hampshire have been excited about him for a while, but they've just got, we haven't seen much of red ball cricket because they've got such a good attack. You've got Abbott, Abbas,
Barker.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And when he has played his bowl well, but you don't get that many overs because Abbas and Abbott usually hoover up the wickets before you get a chance.
Before we move on, we are just 2 weeks away, just over 2 weeks away from our first ever live show, and it's not too late to get yourself tickets. We've called it a live show, but it's also a sort of end of season dinner. There's a meal and a drink included in the ticket, and as well as us lot, we've got Mark Butcher coming in, we've got Ollie Robinson joining us as well. And as we mentioned before, the venue is in Victoria. The charity The Passage are hosting us. They have a vision for where street homelessness no longer exists and everyone has a place to call home. An organisation close to our hearts here. So it's going to be an amazing evening. It's all for a good cause. Get involved. It should be a really fun way to wrap up the summer. The link to get your tickets is in the description. Get involved. Tickets are running out fast. Phil, what's your moment of the week?
Well, I've gone round the houses. I wanted to do initially. I'll be quick. I wanted to do actually initially the game here at the 100 game last week, which was just a great show, great spectacle. Forget the hoary old arguments, the for and against. It was the night after we'd recorded the show, Katya and me and Ben, and it was Oval Invincibles against London Spirit. It's double header. The women were in the afternoon. It was a kind of slow burner game, but the men's game caught fire. And although the punters here drift in and out of the spectacle, the last half an hour was just brilliant stuff, brilliant sport. And it was an amazing finale. The game ebbed and flowed. It was the first 100 game where I've been properly gripped by it. And the atmosphere finally seemed to suit or match up to what the ECB were trying to pull off. Now, this is just one anecdotal story. I'm not getting into all the rest of it. There'll be other experiences for other people elsewhere in the country, but that was great. But then, of course, what happens is cricket does its thing over the course of the next few days. And the story that I can't shake, and there's two elements to this, but I'll just focus on the South Africa test tour to New Zealand in January, right? And sometimes a story comes along that is so unambiguously bleak that it obliterates any idea of nuance and balance, and it just shows you the truth of where the game is in certain parts of the world. And I talk about this reality that South Africa will be sending a C team at best, possibly even a D team, test team, for 2 test series against New Zealand. And the reason being, of course, their domestic T20 tournament is running concurrently. And so it means that the skipper, Bavuma, won't be playing. Markram, Rabada, Nortje, Klaasen, Van der Dusen, and Ngidi, all of these top quality, Janssen, all of these top quality cricketers, all of whom, by the way, want to play Test cricket.
And get precious few opportunities.
Precious few opportunities. I think 6 games in 2 or 3 years or some madness. And the CEO of CSA made it quite clear that they're not rowing back from this decision. This is how it is. Now, Dean Elgar, who, if you like, straddles the 2 eras, and he's nobody's fool, and he understands the financial realities of South African cricket because he's been up against that brick wall himself as skipper for a number of years anyway. He said 3 or 4 days back, a high percentage of the players still really want to play Test cricket, and it's just extremely sad. Crucial here, clarifies a lot of things when it comes to how Test cricket is viewed by the authorities. We can't butter our bread on both sides here, but what's the bigger picture? And how would New Zealand cricket, with whom we probably have the strongest relationship of all the other countries, view us sending a C team over there? It will cause the breakdown in our relationship with New Zealand cricket. Now, CSA are brassic, and they want desperately to try and replenish the coffers. And they are arguing, and this is where it becomes crucial or existential. They are arguing, well, we need to find more money streams in order to replenish the first class system. And without that, we can't prioritise Test cricket. But we are trying to, folks, just bear with us. And that's the argument. That's what they're saying. But when you have something as short-sighted as this and as unequivocal as this, New Zealand can't move that because those Test matches, because they are central to their summer, central to their whole system. South Africa signed up to those games. If CSA are completely intransigent and they won't send any of their best players, not just a sprinkling, but any of them, then how can they possibly claim that what they're actually doing is trying to future-proof the red ball game and not basically just accelerate its downward spiral? And I want there to be more player voices in this. Elgar is an elder statesman, and so he can say this. He can talk, if you like, from inside the dressing room, but without fear of favour. I want to hear from other players. I want there to be some reaction to this. I want Temba and other players to come out and, or certainly be having conversations behind closed doors if they don't have it via the media, because this is a devastating story for their cricket in the short term and the long term, but for obviously the world game as well.
I absolutely agree on more player voices in general, not in just this circumstance. There seems to be like passivity amongst players who will talk up Test cricket and then just shrug their shoulders as though its demise is inevitable. You know, they're the ones who are actually going and playing these games. They have huge sway. If players don't want to play, we're in an era of huge player power. If players don't want to play, they won't play. And, you know, and it ends up being that, well, do they actually mean what they say? Or is it just paying lip service to Test cricket? They say it's the most important thing, but is it actually not to them? Because they want to sort out their bank balance. You know, if that is the case, I can kind of respect that, but it's increasingly annoying to try and be kind of played both ways. And you hear it a lot. We do interviews with people all the time telling us how important this thing is, and then do things that show they don't believe that at all.
Yeah, maybe I'm being a bit naive, but I think some of the players have a lot of power here in that Cricket South Africa isn't their sole source of income. A lot of these players will earn more money from IPL contracts than they will even from the SA20 topping up whatever they're paid by CSA anyway. And their involvement in whatever South African cricket are trying to do is utterly pivotal to the success of what South African cricket are trying to do. So be it the SA20 or Test cricket. So I feel like they are probably more powerful than they might appreciate, and are quite quickly more powerful than they would have been 5 years ago, just because of the money they get from the IPL.
They probably are, but I still think player power can only go so far. You have to look at, you know, the structures and the leadership and the structure that Test cricket and cricket as a whole has gone down over the last few years. So I completely get putting more onus on the players to speak out, and I agree with Joe that some players just, you know, do stuff that completely goes against what they say, or they don't say anything, and it's really, really frustrating. But to put the entirety of the onus on the players to change an embedded structure, I think is naive and slightly impractical. There needs to be a greater analysis and a greater change than simply the players are a surface level. They're the most visible people, and that's the surface. It has to go deeper. If you don't want these things to happen, if you don't want a CD team to go to New Zealand, there has to be a deeper change, and it has to come
for sure. Absolutely,
out.
But who's going to force that change? And we've seen the administrators aren't. So if it's not going to be them, then it's got to come from the players. They can't make those changes happen, but they can certainly put a lot more pressure on than they are currently.
True.
Yeah, and all the strands join up in the end, right? The ICC's World Test Championship, the ICC's international bilateral cricket landscape is embarrassed by this reality, okay? So if Cricket South Africa doesn't have the money to, in effect, compensate the players who want to play Test cricket over that 3-week period, rather than play in the SA T20. And if Elgar is right, And what he says is reflective of that team, that test team. But CSA doesn't have the money to compensate those players so that the players aren't out of pocket themselves. Then this is where the ICC has to come in, right? Because the ICC in the end is on its knees here in this scenario. So if CSA need some kind of propping up for this 1 year, this mad turn of events, then the ICC needs to come in, right? Surely they need to get around a table, CSA and the ICC, and say, right, this is the problem here. We've got a bunch of players that want to maintain the sanctity of Test cricket, but we need to pay them to ensure that they're not out of pocket and that the T20 tournament is not running at a loss as a consequence and all the rest of it. So that's where the ICC has to come in. There's been a lot of vague talk about test match funds, and big names say it. Graham Smith says it, right? And he's closely involved in these conversations. So what's stopping? What is beyond the wit of human beings here, that if they're losing here but gaining there, can't the ICC, whose reputation is on the line with these stories, can't they come in somewhere down the line and help soften the blow in the short term?
It's the step before.
Am I speaking bollocks here?
No, I think it's the step before that's the most important, in that South African cricket has been pretty upfront in the last year that they need their own revenue stream that is not reliant on certain boards touring. So they're basically like, I think it was, if India tour, we make money. If Australia and England tour, we break even. And if anyone else tours, we lose money. So they need to have their own revenue stream that exists, that they control. Cricket South Africa need to have their own revenue stream, and they clearly see that their players are having their best possible players to play, and it makes the tournament more value, and that brings in more money. I guess there's lots of problems here. There's a serious problem about how condensed that bit of the schedule is. That kind of January to March pre-IPL period is when that is the home summer for most countries. And that is also the time where a lot of boards want to be playing these T20 competitions, a lot of money going around. There is just way too much cricket in that block in particular. And if you've also got between a 4 to 6 week, 7 week even ICC tournament every single year, that's a block. You can't really play that much cricket in the Northern Hemisphere summer. That's another block gone. IPL block. There's very, very little time for a lot of cricket to be played. And that is... that's a separate problem to the South African money issue. But
with a New Zealand Test cricket then, WTC finalists a couple of years ago, that's when they play their Test cricket.
Yeah. Between
January and March. Where do they go? They're already completely stuffed by this scenario. The other thing about the SA T20, which is a really good tournament, by the way, it was good fun. They had a really good selection of players, because the money's pretty good, because it's like a feeder or a sister tournament to the IPL. And so they get good people through the gates, good overseas players. Now, are we really saying that the finances of that tournament hinge on whether, the handful of their homegrown players are featuring it or not, when you have such a good sprinkling of overseas players across the thing? And if the idea of the Big Bash, that it's not necessarily about the players on the pitch, it's about the event, and the same thing sort of applies over here as well with our T20 stuff and our 100 stuff, then does it really hinge on whether Aidan Markram is playing for the Sunrisers or whether he's playing in the...
I think it does.
It might do.
I think it does, because different T20 tournaments have different aims. I think Big Bash and 100 are more about growing the game, make it more family friendly. I think SA20 is more... it's more obviously money, income. We want to make as much money as possible, and reliably so, which I think does rely on Rabada, Markram, etc. playing in it.
I just desperately hope they can find some kind of balance then. Temba Bavuma didn't even play for the majority of their tournament last year. He was their sort of white ball skipper, didn't even play in it. I hope they can put up some kind of team, but it's still, it's sticking plaster over a gaping hole here. However they swing it, there are real problems at bay. And look, you mentioned about that slot. Well, the Mark Wood story this week, he's been named in one of the teams in Dubai to play in the ILT20.
The most miserable of all the T20 tournaments.
And what's running concurrently, England go to India for a 5-test series. And unless Stokes is particularly persuasive, or crucially, the ECB can offer significant financial package to Wood, then it's looking likely that England's most effective, game-changing fast bowler away from home will be playing in Dubai instead of in India for a 5-test series.
I still have some hope.
So do I.
That the chaos of that tournament basically means that Wood is still going to play the test series and that he'll only play the first chunk of that tournament. If he plays the whole tournament, then he's out of the first 3 tests. But I think there's a reasonable chance that Wood, centrally contracted as well, is available for...
But that's the key. So the central contract is the key. How much money in bare facts will be presented to him on the table and what the nature of that central contract will be. And then it will be down to his own decision and I guess the persuasiveness of his skipper and his coach.
I was thinking about this. Sorry, Kesh. When we were having this conversation yesterday morning, about how miserable it was, I was trying to sort of try and find a silver lining. Wood can't know that he's going to be fit for Test series. There is always a chance that he will get injured and not be able to play in them. So is there a case that why wouldn't you sign up for this T20 tournament and you can kind of pull out at the last minute, like players seem to do all the time in tournaments around the world? Is it possible that this is his backup option should he not be able to play Test cricket this time next year? I don't know. It's hopeful. It's an optimistic interpretation of events, but maybe there's an element. I mean, I'm just guessing.
Well,
there's an element.
We see with 100 how many players sign up for it and will not be there for the business end. You know, like that Oval Invincibles team, the first team to qualify for the final. Like Spencer Johnson, he's going to miss it because he's playing some T20s against Africa, I think. So it's possible that that's what Wood's doing as well.
I think it's also worth saying that Joe Root's also signed and contracted in this tournament, but Joe Root will be playing all 5 tests in India. So I don't think it's a given that Wood's not going to play all those 5 tests. And I think he won't play all those 5 tests, but he will probably leave that tournament early. So it's not like, I don't think it's the end of the world discussion that some people have, put it as.
Well, I really, really hope you're right.
If Root misses a test match
that won't happen. And he's on the record.
That would be the end.
He's
of
on record saying that won't happen. But I think it is a bit murkier with someone like Wood. He's obviously had big injury problems. 33-year-old, and it'll be a massive pay packet. They've also made him front and centre of their marketing campaign, the whoever they are's. But yeah, look, it will come down to various factors. It would break my heart if he's playing in Dubai in front of nobody for money. When
they get a lot of
David Cameron. David Cameron was there last time.
Yeah.
Anyway,
doubly break my heart.
Anyway, moving on. England have named a couple of squads for Sri Lanka's tour here in September. The headlines are Sophie Eccleston and Sophia Dunkley are rested from both series. Tammy Beaumont, who's the in-form English batter at the moment, still can't get into the squad. There are first call-ups for Mahika Gore, the 17-year-old left-armer who's previously played for the UAE. She actually made her international debut when she was 12. And Bess Heath, the 22-year-old keeper who whacks it as one of the highest strike rates in the 100 this year. And Freya Kemp is back after a year out. She'll play as a specialist batter. Katya, there's quite a lot to unpack here. First of all, talk us through the Beaumont situation. One of England's greatest ever ODI batters. Hasn't been involved in the T20 setup recently, but is in the form of her life with a T20 World Cup not that far away. What is happening?
I don't think I can talk you through the Beaumont decision because I don't really understand it. John Lewis's argument for it was that he already knows what Beaumont can do in T20s, so he doesn't need to look at her and he'd rather look at someone else. I think Maya Boucher is set to open the batting with Danny Wyatt. But so for context, like Tammy Beaumont was dropped last year from the T20 squad for the South Africa series before the Commonwealth Games because they wanted to go with a more explosive opening partnership. And at the time, that's not what Beaumont offered as an opener. So they went with Sophia Dunkley and they went with Danny Wyatt. And as great as those two are, Dunkley hasn't really hit her strides yet in T20 international cricket and hasn't really been that consistent at the top of the order. Whereas Tammy Beaumont has gone through almost a complete transformation in the way she plays T20 cricket over the course of the last year. She had a strike rate of over 140 in the Charlotte Edwards Cup this year. She's just scored 100 in the 100. She, in the ODIs, in the Ashes ODIs, she played some remarkable innings, not to mention that the test match double 100. And to look at what a player has done, has gone away, changed the way they played to the way that you wanted them to play, and then not pick her, I think, is a bit of a farce, especially when you're not picking Dunkley either. You're putting Dunkley's rested for that series, as you said. The other day, you had Beaumont and Dunkley break the record for the highest score in the power play in 100, and neither of them are playing for England against Sri Lanka in the upcoming series. That just seems a bit mad to me, you know. And I think there is every chance that come the T20 World Cup in, I think it's September, October next year, Tammy Beaumont will be back in the T20I side. But it just seems such an odd decision to essentially treat Sri Lanka as a development series, not play Beaumont. And John Lewis clarified as well, the decision was made after Beaumont's 100 in the 100. I just think it's a bit of a farce, really, a bit of a disaster.
I thought it was a bit strange to leave Dunkley out, given that she didn't make many runs against Australia as well. This felt like quite a good series to get her back on track. Maybe they just think she's knackered, she needs a rest at the end of the summer. But it looks, from her form for Welsh Fire over the last kind of few games, it looks like she's in quite good touch. I'd have thought they'd want to kind of get her going again. It does strike me as a bit odd, bit of a strange call.
It sounds like a bit of sort of pig-headedness to me. You know, coach knows best, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. You know, like in a football match where someone comes on as sub, scores 4, and then still is on the bench the next game. You know, it feels a little bit like...
He also said, you know, Maya Boucher, she's travelled around, she's been in reserve, it's her turn.
These are international cricket matches.
Yeah, that's not how
Boucher hasn't batted higher. Boucher hasn't batted higher than 5 in T20s for England, I don't think. And from what John Lewis said, I think the point was that she was going to open. I might be wrong on that, but that's what I took away.
That's how I read it as well
from the discussion. But also, it's worth saying, Beaumont was dropped before John Lewis came in as coach, so it's not Lewis who's dropped her. He doesn't have the same, like, I made this decision, I'm going to stick with this decision. He could easily bring her back. So I just think it's a bit of an odd one, to be honest. She's the best T20 batter in the country at the minute, going on the 100. To not pick her is just really odd.
Also potentially creates the problem if Boucher has a great series at the top of the order against Sri Lanka, who have had some good results against New Zealand but aren't a particularly strong side. That could end up kind of creating a difficult situation for him. Then you have to keep her going, right? Otherwise or at least keep her in the squad above Beaumont. To then elevate Beaumont above someone who's made some runs in the most recent series would be quite a tricky thing to do. So I think he's created a problem where there didn't need to be one, really.
David asks, Izzy Wong appears to have been chronically underused since the World Cup, in which she was left out of the side. After a blistering WPL, everything seems, from a fan's perspective, to have gone south. Despite her image being heavily used in England's marketing, she didn't get a game in the Ashes. Now we hear Birmingham Phoenix have dropped her to work on her action mid-tournament. Can you guys shed any light on what's going on? Has the ECB let her down by initially believing the hype around her too much and adding to that hype, or was the hype justified? And what did the Mumbai Indians under Charlotte Edwards do so differently? Quite a lot going on there as well. But yeah, what Wong is someone who's really highly regarded, but is in the squad for the Sri Lanka series, but is unlikely to play. And she's been left out of the Birmingham Phoenix side recently to work on her action.
Izzy Wong's kind of the sad story of this summer, right? Her face was plastered all over the billboards for the Ashes, and game after game, she was running the drinks or on the sidelines. And it's really quite sad to see that she's not in a place with her bowling where she is, you know, able to come out for England and produce what she has produced or what she promised she could produce. She's such a promising young bowler that, you know, to write her off now would be completely counterproductive. But I do think it's odd the way England have managed her by keeping her around the side, selecting her in the Sri Lanka squad that she's unlikely to play in, and keeping that question going, if that makes sense. It would have made sense for me to drop her, get those headlines done, say go back, you know, work on this, you're still very much part of our plans, than keep stringing her along and keep that question going around her of when will Izzy Wong come back in the side. And talking about the WPL, I don't think there was anything massively differently that was done with her. She got that hat-trick at the end of the tournament, but before that she wasn't bowling quite as consistently anyway that she would be expected to bowl. But yeah, it is a sad story, but hopefully it can have a positive ending. She's still really young. She's only just turned 21
a couple of months ago.
You know,
I think actually, if anything, and I think maybe we've been guilty as well, you believe the hype a bit too much and you expect a bit too much too soon, and the WPL obviously raised those expectations even further. You know, young fast bowlers, very few just have a immediately kind of straight trajectory where it goes from never heard of to being brilliant.
James Anderson. You know, had 2 years where he couldn't land it on the cut strip.
But I think you can also turn this into more of a positive story, not just for Wong, but for the development the England side has gone through, that you've got these fast bowlers, these young fast bowlers who have come through and taken their opportunities. To think about Lauren Filer, we wouldn't have been talking about Lauren Filer 3 months ago. So, you know, you've got Lauren Filer, who's come in, probably the quickest bowler in the country at the minute. Mahika Gore, 17, 6 foot. You know, you've got these bowlers coming through. Freya Kemp might not be bowling at the minute, but she will come back into the picture. Lauren Bell, all these players. You know, for years we thought what was going to happen when Katherine Sciver-Brunt and when Anya Shrubsole retire, but there's such a depth of players now for them to choose from. That's the really positive thing about this.
And I think that she's just turned 21 and she's just working through her action. I don't think it's much more complicated than that. That happens to 21-year-old fast bowlers. And I think because I do think there's a perception that she's older than she is just because of how long she's been talked about. She kind of attracted attention when she was 17, probably playing in the KSL. Anyway, moving on. Joe, what's your moment of the week?
I guess address some of the bigger questions in the World Game. I'm going to focus on the Metro Bank One Day Cup, which has... Well, it depends on your focus, but has maybe slipped under the radar for the last few weeks while the hundreds on the telly. But I think the county fans have been still turning up at grounds, some out grounds, getting some cricket. There's been some criticism of the way the tournament's been handled by the ECB. Certainly Somerset aren't happy that they play this tournament with so few players available. Surrey have been getting hammered twice a week for the last few weeks, which obviously brings a lot of joy to everyone who's not a Surrey supporter, but won't be going down hugely well with the Oval faithful. But in amongst that, there's been some great stories as well, and I wanted to pick out Leicestershire, who beat Yorkshire on Sunday, which was their 5th win in a row, their 7th of 8 in the group stages. So they're already through to the knockouts. I think depending on Hampshire's result today, Leicestershire could go straight through to the semi-finals. That's what happens if you top the group. Then second and third play in quarter-finals, although they're not quarter-finals if you only have 2 of them. Playoffs, I guess. And it's just been, just a heartening story, really. Paul Nixon got given his marching orders. So you've got James Taylor and Alfonso Thomas as interim coaches. They've benefited from not having too many players disappear to the 100. I think it was only Rian Ahmed and Callum Parkinson. Then Ackerman's recently joined Southern Brave. So they've got a strong side, Mulder, Hanscom, and then some young talent. Rishi Patel's continued to have a brilliant season. Sol Buddinger's done really well at the top of the order. Just comes out and as a hit. As we saw Louis Kimber score a really good 80-odd against Surrey in their opening game, which kind of set the tone for what's followed. So I think it's Friday is the quarterfinals and then Tuesday is the semi-finals. And I've found myself really rooting for Leicestershire in a way that I didn't necessarily expect at the start of the tournament. I think it's a really good story, and there's obviously issues with the One Day Cup, but for all its problems, it does create those same problems, create some nice stories along the way. And if Leicestershire can be in the mix for some silverware, and we can see some really good young players coming through, it's not all bad. And I imagine a lot of county fans have actually really enjoyed the last few weeks, particularly if you're a Leicestershire fan.
And also Worcestershire as well, similar level of club, I suppose. Hit a tiny bit or a little bit by the 100, but not obliterated by the 100, and they've now qualified in Group B as well, alongside Warwickshire that you'd perhaps expect to, but Worcestershire have had a really good run at it as well, and it's a happy accident, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah.
And just on Worcestershire, I think they were reporting their highest attendances in 50 over cricket in a decade. So that massively predates the start of the 100.
Yeah.
So that's really encouraging.
Fascinating club, really, Worcester. I mean, if you look at the players that they've delivered, this used to be the thing about Leicester maybe 10, 15 years ago that you see, that they had Broad and James Taylor and Nathan Buck and so on coming through their system before then moving on. Worcestershire are the same. And while it feels like there's a constant drain of quality going out through the doors, and there's more stories in the last month. Jack Haynes, brilliant young player, he's off to Notts along with the 2 quicks, Pennington, and obviously the test player Josh Tongue. But they still keep producing them. Ed Barnard is another one, left to go to Warwickshire. He's top run scorer in the whole tournament, opening the batting. He's also taken 10 wickets in it. These are all Worcestershire graduates. And so if you are a Worcester fan, and as you say, they're selling out, you're going to be simultaneously proud and frustrated, but at least you're a part of the scrap. At least you're a part of the story of English cricket, and that lazy idea that, well, if you're not producing players to move on and to potentially play international cricket, what's the point of you? Well, there can be no argument that Worcestershire are an absolutely key part of the ecosystem, even though you look at the imbalance, the financial imbalance that they suffer with, are surrounded by those bigger counties. Well, they're still doing an absolutely invaluable job for the game.
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's rooting for a Worcestershire final. That'd be
Totally.
great.
Yeah.
Slightly oddly, the final isn't until September the 16th. So having all this cricket crammed in, then there's like a couple of week gap or 3 weeks gap. By which time, obviously, the 100 is long gone, so you can pick your 100 players. Although Kent last year decided not to, and then went on to win it, which was a nice story in itself. So it'll be interesting to see what other counties decide to do when their 100 players come back, if their side's got them to the final.
English cricket just loves that, doesn't it? Having a final a month after the rest of the competition. It almost was the norm in the blast.
I don't mind that really. You know, it's been very condensed anyway, and it doesn't hurt to have a bit of a breather, cut 2 or 3 weeks, and then you have a final on its own terms, mid-September.
And they certainly rattle along with the quarters and the semis. And they're done within 2 days of the groups finishing.
Yeah, like last time out, the final was on a Thursday, right?
Yeah.
The one
In
before
Trent
last, I think. Last year they sorted it out, but yeah.
Katya, what was your moment of the week?
My moment of the week was Katherine Sciver-Brunt's final professional cricket match a couple of days ago. She struggled through it a bit. She had a what looked like quite a nasty hip injury. But in the same week, actually, I think that Anya Shrubsole played her last professional game for Southern Brave. But yeah, just an opportunity to say thank you and I guess goodbye to someone who's been so fundamental to England's story and to the story of women's cricket over the last, almost 20 years, I guess. And this summer, in that way, has felt like a transition from the era before the professional era, or the final part of that transition from the era before the professional to now. And it was really quite a moving end when she was going around Trent Bridge saying thank you to all the fans. And I was really disappointed, actually. I was hoping she was going to be playing at the Oval, but I guess that was quite naive.
I was thinking, Katya, that your first ever podcast you did with us, and the first question was, who's your favourite cricketer? That was Katherine Brunt. Was that the answer?
Well remembered. Yeah, it was definitely. I'm a massive Katherine Sciver-Brunt fan. She's been the cricketer that's kind of coincided with my following of cricket most as I've grown up. And I think what she embodies to a lot of the younger generation of cricket fans is really important. And it does feel like a final part of that chapter of that side and that era, which was quite moving. Rather than just saying goodbye to a player, it felt like you're saying thanks, but this is where we are now, and we're moving forward. And you've put so much good into the game, and really, what can you ask for from a career than putting good into the game? To be honest.
And you got got a big guard of honour at the end of yesterday's game, even though she didn't play.
Yeah,
I saw on the video at the end. I think someone from the social media team's coming to try and take a photo. And she goes, "Just leave me alone." I don't think she found the whole thing like entirely comfortable.
Yeah,
but she'll definitely be missed. I think she's got other business. You chatted to her about her. Is it like properties? Is that she's doing on the side?
She's got a whole portfolio.
Yeah, wow.
But she's started doing quite a lot of media stuff as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully she's not going to be too far away from the game.
I think it's worth saying this is like, I've probably made it sound a bit like a funeral. It's not like, she'll still be in and around the game, and she was brilliant on commentary for the Ashes this summer. I spoke to Melissa Story a few weeks ago, and she said you just put a mic in front of her and just let her go, because she just absolutely spouts gold. And it's great when that's playing as well to watch her commentate on that.
The 100 finishes this week in the men's competition. Oval, the first team to book a spot in the final, and in the women's competition, it's between Southern Brave, Superchargers, and Welsh Fire. We'll do a proper review of both competitions in next week's show after the two finals. To end the show, just a few headlines from around the world. India announced a squad for the Asia Cup, which is interesting with the World Cup just down the road. Bumrah, Rahul, and Iyer are all in it, having all recently come back from long-term injuries. India are currently playing Ireland in a T20I series. India are always playing a bilateral series somewhere in the world.
I saw some footage of Rishabh Pant as well.
He's batting.
Having a whack.
Yeah,
in a club game or something or other game.
It's not a definite no for the World Cup.
Right, okay.
But it's a probable no, I believe, at this stage. UAE beat New Zealand in a T20I the other day. New Zealand won the series 2-1 in the end, but obviously that's a big result for the UAE. And a word on Wanindu Hasaranga, who's had a big week. So the Lanka Premier League has come and gone. And Hasaranga had an incredible tournament where he scored the most runs, took the most wickets, had the best bowling average, had the best economy rate, the best batting strike rate, the best bowling figures, the most sixes, the 2 fastest 50s, and he was the captain of the side that won the competition but didn't play in the final because of injury. He also retired from Test cricket in the last week, having taken 4 wickets at 100 from 4 Test matches and hadn't played a game for more than 2 years. So he's packed in quite a lot in the last week. I don't think that's as depressing a retirement as others maybe at the moment. He's not really been in Sri Lanka's Test plans recently, and I think the final straw was being picked in like a massive provisional squad and having to miss a franchise tournament or at least part of it to basically be the 30th man in a 30-man squad. So I think it's his relationship with the Sri Lanka cricket is cordial at the moment. I think he just put forward across the argument that, well, if you don't really need me, I could be doing, I've got other things I could be doing rather than taking part in the provisional squad. Anyway, that is all for today's show. Well done for getting to the end. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Katya. We'll be back next week. And if you're near London, get those tickets for the live show.